launch into our election recap. 1 seat, 2 seat, red seat, blue seat. For those of you who are parents or grandparents, I'm sure you've read a lot of Dr. Seuss, and boy, the whole election did kind of have a pretty surreal feel, very Dr. Seussian in a lot of ways. But to get started and to kind of get everybody warmed up, we want to do a little poll time. Usually if we were together, we'd be doing the handheld clickers. But we're going to be putting a poll up on your screen just to kind of get a sense of what part of the state are you from? Where are you from? The Twin Cities area there, that's for the benefit of our staff so they can participate too. So let's kind of just get a sense of where we're from. All right, Kelly, do we have results? There we go. Oh, pretty evenly split. Looks like the Southwest is the big winner in terms of attendance. So very good job. Secondly, very curious, is this your first CGMC event that you've ever attended in terms of a conference or legislative action day? All right, so we've got a handful of first-timers and a good cohort of veterans. Well, excellent. Welcome to everyone. Again, like I said, we're very excited to have everybody here. So, one last question. So regardless of COVID-19, I'm interested if the fact that this is held virtual in a condensed format, not overnight, that sort of thing, influenced your decision to attend. And so your options are, yes, the ease of virtual conferences swayed my decision to attend. If there was no COVID-19, I would have preferred to attend in person, or whether it's in person or virtual, I just love CGMC events.
Bradley, is that considered fishing for a compliment? C, is that
it's up to you, however you want to take it. Interesting. Okay, well, very good. Very good. Well, I hope that folks will find this of value, and no matter how we hold events, you'll want to participate here in the future. So 2020, as I said, was a pretty historic election year. Turnout nationally was absolutely off the charts with almost 152 million voters for Biden and Trump alone, not counting the other presidential candidates, not counting Kanye casting ballots. And so a pretty significant turnout. And against the backdrop, as we all know, of a very challenging year in terms of the pandemic, with more absentee votes, more mail-in voting, longer counting, all of that. And for a while there, margins that were hard to tell which direction they were going as the counting continued in the days after the election. So just a kind of gut feeling here. Are you personally happy with the outcome of the 2020 election?
There should be another choice of a mixed happiness.
Yeah, we want to force you into one or the other. All right, so about 70% are happy with the outcome, and 30% are less than happy with the outcome. All right. So the national results. We want to, before we drill into Minnesota, we want to take a quick sort of scan of the national scene. As we know, Joe Biden wins, and I think it's debatable whether or not that was a vote for Biden, a vote against Trump, or a vote based on some other basis. This is a look nationally that was put together by the New York Times of kind of counties that had largely finished their vote and the extent to which they swung more Democratic or more Republican over the last, since 2016. And yesterday I came across an interesting tidbit from National Public Radio. They did an analysis of 3,000 counties across the state. And what they found was that in 2020, there were far fewer counties that flipped from one party to the other than in 2016. So in 2016, you had 237 counties changed allegiances from what the 2012 results were, with 216 of them going from former President Obama to President Trump. What we saw in 2020 actually was that only 77 counties so far in their analysis had flipped, with 66 of them going from Trump in 2016 to Biden in 2020. So, I think, I kind of look at this map, and the way that I describe it is that the red got redder and the blue got bluer. If you look at kind of results nationally, this is not anything of a surprise or anything that we don't already sort of intuitively understand in terms of where the clusters of votes are. The blue being Democrats clustered in, major metropolitan areas, and the Republicans spread out throughout the balance of the country and smaller metros. That's a story that we're well familiar with. No real surprise there. U.S. Senate and House, I think, is one of those things that, has had a lot of folks scratching their heads in terms of the outcome and why the Democrats didn't gain more seats in the Senate. Obviously, we still have 2 that need to be resolved in Georgia, and then why they lost seats actually in the U.S. House. With the polling looking the way it was, I think there was a broad expectation that the Democrats would, if not anything, just gain seats. And that was certainly the case at the state level too. And so I think that's one of the confounding things about this particular election, given the strong result for Biden and the very weak result overall for Democrats in Congress. So as we think about the election, what do you think was the biggest factor in the election? Was it the economy? Was it the handling of COVID-19? Was it just strong feelings about Trump, either positive or negative, in terms of influencing the results? Interesting. And your feelings collectively aligned with mine. That's how I voted, is I thought that it really had to do largely coming down to what you thought of Trump. And so we'll see here the exit polls showing, and again, not tremendously surprising or shocking results in these, but generally, if you felt that the efforts to contain the coronavirus were going well, you tended to vote for Trump. If you thought they were going badly, you voted for Biden. What's interesting, I think, is that it is a roughly 50-50 split between how people generally think things are going. Likewise, in terms of people's personal financial situation, if you felt like you were doing okay, you were more likely to vote for Trump. If you felt that you were suffering from severe financial hardship, overwhelmingly you voted for Biden. Again, nothing tremendously surprising in these results, but I think, more confirming what we would have already thought. Another exit poll question, this one just kind of generally on the status of the economy writ large, not anybody's personal situation. Again, about 50-50 in terms of how people felt about the economy generally, and again, pretty strongly split depending on how you felt. If you felt things were going excellent or good, you were significantly more likely to vote for Trump. If 50% that thought it was not so good or poor, you were significantly more likely to vote for Biden. Again, it stands to reason. Again, I think the sort of 50-50 nature of people's feelings on these issues is pretty interesting. So the presidential race in Minnesota, there are the contenders. Frankly, the most amazing thing I think about this slide is the picture in the lower right of a young Joe Biden and a young Donald Trump when they were in their fighting trim. And so kind of interesting there to see those guys age over time. So again, things that I think align largely with what we would have thought going into this. Where did Biden win? Where did Trump win? The top graph there is, intensity by county of Trump votes, where we have some counties where, Trump was upwards of 75% of the vote. with the lighter color, the less intense Trump voters being clustered in Hennepin and Ramsey County. The opposite in terms of the Biden vote, with some counties going for Biden by 70% or so. So again, it reflects that split nationally that we saw in the nationwide bubble graph, and it's reflected here in terms of where the votes come out of for each candidate in Minnesota. So this is, I think, interesting and something that I've thought about a lot every time we do these analyses, is just the change over time in terms of the political geography in Minnesota. And so this is the 2012 Obama-Romney race, 2016 Clinton-Trump, and then our 2020 race. And what you see in 2012, and it was even more pronounced in 2008, if we had that map up, that there were several counties throughout rural Minnesota that that voted for the Democrat, and the intensity of vote against the Republican was somewhat less so in at least parts of the 7-county metro. You slide over to 2016, and you see the concentration that we now are living with in terms of very much Democrat vote concentrated in the metro area, and the Duluth North Shore, Olmsted County, and then the rest of the state red. Sliding back to 2012 or 2020, you see that Biden won back 4 counties that Trump had won: Clay, Nicollet, Blue Earth, and Winona, that in greater Minnesota. And so a little bit of a reset there, but certainly not going back to the kind of map that we had in 2008 to 2012. In fact, if you look at the state Senate results, or a state Senate map for that time period in 2012, you had Democrats representing the entire northern tier of the state, from Lake Superior to North Dakota. And so things have changed, obviously, significantly in that, and we'll talk a little bit about the legislative breakdown here in a second. So where did Biden win? Again, most of his votes, just on a kind of raw total, came out of the 7-county metro area, 1.1 million, with Trump garnering 650,000 from the 7-county metro. The remaining counties, we see the balance, going towards Trump, with Biden still getting 562,000 votes in the remaining counties. And that gives you your final result there, 1.7 million for Biden and almost 1.5 for Trump. Drilling in a little bit just on the Joe Biden in the 7-county metro versus Trump statewide. We did this analysis with the Governor Walz, Jeff Johnson race, and there, Walz between the 7-county metro, Olmsted, and St. Louis counties, Rochester and Duluth, that was enough votes for him to win versus all of Jeff Johnson's statewide total. And so not quite the same dynamic here, but pretty close. And you can just see just the generation of votes for Joe Biden coming out of the 7-county metro compared to everywhere else in the state. So a little bit look at just kind of Republican results in general. And what we see, and this I think kind of stands to reason and probably isn't terribly surprising, is that President Trump ran behind both the total vote totals, if you add up all of the races for the GOP Senate, as well as the GOP House. And interestingly, what we see is the opposite on the Democratic side, where Joe Biden outran the vote totals for DFL House and Senate candidates. And I think this, again, kind of stands to reason, because if what we collectively said at the beginning was true, that this really was kind of how you felt about Trump, positive or negative, that's where you see the split in terms of these vote totals on a party basis. So statewide elections, total votes in millions here. We did this again, 2 years ago, as we looked at all of the statewide races. Remember, every constitutional officer was on the ballot, as well as 2 Senate races and the legislature. And so, again, you add up all of the votes, Biden outran everybody. And then it's, in each one of those categories, in each one of those head-to-head, on the Democratic side, the DFL side, they garnered more votes than on the Republican side. And so, again, a little bit of an indication, I think, of kind of where the state seems to be. And this was the pattern from 2018 as well. And so I think, that begs the question, and one that I wonder about is, we've not had a Republican win a statewide race since 2006. That was when Pawlenty was last elected governor. But no constitutional officers on the Republican side were elected that year, and nor has they won a statewide race since then. And so do you see, given the environment, a Republican winning a statewide race either in 2022 or 2024? Interesting. So a little bit more closely split, but still with the belief that it is unlikely that a Republican will win a statewide race here in the next couple of years. So voter turnout in Minnesota. So first off, yay for us. Minnesota is #1 again. I think we just edged out the state of Maine for that title. And so collectively, we should all be very proud. I hear celebration and champagne corks in the background there. And rightfully so, gosh darn it. And so, and as it turns out, statewide turnout is the highest in 70 years, since the 1950s. So we smashed it collectively here. And I think that goes to people's belief in our civic institutions and participation and the security of the vote. So good for us there. So now getting into some numbers that I found really interesting, and I actually found this number maybe just kind of the most interesting, in that, in greater Minnesota, we had significant increase in voter turnout over the last couple of years, and certainly over 2016. And so, by over 100,000 votes, we had more votes in greater Minnesota than in 2016. Nonetheless, greater Minnesota's share of the total vote statewide went down. And so even though greater Minnesota crushed it coming out, with an extra 100,000 plus voters this year, we are still down in terms of what our share of the statewide total is. And so, what it turns out is the Metro turned out in record numbers. I saw, one analyst at the state level basically said, greater Minnesota voted like it was 2016. The suburban Minnesota voted like it was 2018, and Hennepin County voted like never before. And so we see that reflected here in the voter turnout in the 7-county metro, where again, 200,000 additional votes over 2016 versus in 2020. So, county or metro-wide, significant increase in turnout. And really, largely, so much of that was driven by Hennepin County itself. And I think there's, a number of possibilities. Certainly population increase over time in Hennepin County would suggest that this would be the direction that we're going. But also too, and what I would attribute personally, much more of the increase to is just the efforts on the part of the DFL, progressive groups generally, and others to turn out the vote. There was significant energy in getting people out to vote in Hennepin County on the part of the Democrats and progressive groups. And I think that is reflective in this total. And I think it is the thing that is most attributable to the increase, even more so than population growth over time here. So as we drill down here into the legislative races and kind of how it's going to impact CGMC's work going forward, we're going to start with the race for the Minnesota House. There's a nice view of the chamber. everyone is appropriately socially distancing from Honest Abe there, and everybody looks safe. So, as I said, one of the head scratching things was the fact that Democrats lost traction in the overall total. Interestingly, I had a conversation with Speaker Hortman a couple of days before the election, and her gut was, she said, if you read the polls, or if you look at the polls, we should gain a bunch of seats, but we don't necessarily trust those. We think that we'll probably hold even. Well, as it turned out, they lost 5 seats statewide, including 3 in Greater Minnesota. And I think, those, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, are significant losses for Greater Minnesota in terms of forwarding an agenda in the House. And so up in the Bemidji area, you had John Purcell, who's chair of the Environment Policy Committee, lose to former Representative Matt Bliss. This was a rematch between the two. John Purcell won the previous election by, about a dozen votes after a recount 2 years ago. But here Matt Bliss, he blistered him. Down in St. Peter, North Mankato and Nicollet County, Jeff Brand lost. He was in his first term. He was, many of you know, a former St. Peter City Councilman, CGMC board member, very active in our group, and went at the legislature, very supportive of all of our CGMC agenda. He, carried the LGA increase bill that we had 2 years ago. He carried child care bills for us. That's going to be a loss that is felt pretty significantly. And then I think for Greater Minnesota generally, Gene Poppy, the chair of the Agriculture Committee, again, longtime legislator, and sad to see her go. And then you had 2 first-term legislators, Ann Claflin and Brad Tapke, who also lost their seats as well. It's hard to know what can be attributed to this. You talk to some folks, and it's a combination of, the Democrats were not going out and door knocking, and many felt that hurt them in the end in terms of not being able to have that face-to-face contact, trying to be respectful of social distancing, et cetera. And then also, some just feel that the messaging coming from the other side in terms of raising concerns around public safety, especially in Minneapolis and St. Paul, really weighed on the minds of rural voters. And so, between the messaging and the tactics, this ended up being what the outcome is. Nonetheless, you still do have DFL control of the House, although narrower. They now control 70 seats to the Republicans' 64. So a little bit of tightening from 2018, but still the same functional outcome in terms of how the House will be conducting its business. One of the things that we tend to look at as a kind of barometer of how rural Minnesota, might do in during the legislative session is to look at what is the makeup of the majority caucus. So in this case, the Democrats in the House on a rural versus metro standpoint. And, again, I went back to talking about 2008, when you had lots of rural DFL members in the legislature, you had, 42% of the caucus was rural versus the metro. In 2012, that narrowed again, another year where the Democrats took control of the House after 2 years of Republican control, but you still had, 38% rural. We are now pretty much at about half that in terms of the rural metro split. So, rural members making up only 21% of the House DFL caucus. That's about 15 members. And what that does is it makes it more difficult for us to get our message across sometimes, to find authors for bills, to find champions on committees for our issues. And so it does provide and make for a challenging atmosphere in the House in terms of the CGMC's agenda. Leadership in the House remains the same. You have Melissa Hortman as the Speaker. She's from Brooklyn Park. And Ryan Winkler, Majority Leader, he is from Golden Valley. No change there in terms of the top of the ticket in the House. And so those will be the 2 faces that you see most often as the Democrats are presenting their agenda, negotiating with the governor and Senate, and leading the effort there. Nonetheless, committees and chairs, they are headed for a shakeup. this summer, Melissa Hortman, the speaker, hinted that there would be fewer and smaller committees. I think anticipating a remote session and trying to focus work and people's energies. Several important for CGMC committees will need new chairs. Ways and Means, which is kind of the overall finance committee, lost its longtime chair, Len Carlson. He retired. And so it's not entirely sure who will be taking that spot. Jobs and Economic Development was vacated by Representative Mahoney from St. Paul, who just retired. And then Environment Policy was, again, John Purcell from the Bemidji area, who was defeated. And so there will be some shuffling around in these chairs. We do anticipate, there's no reason not to, that Representative Marquardt will likely still be the chair of the Tax Committee, which I think is good news for Greater Minnesota. Again, likely we think that Representative Murphy, Mary Murphy, will still be the Capital Investment Chair. Again, I think that's good for Greater Minnesota. And so, some positives there, and then just some unknowns. And we won't know really the committee makeup, structure, chairs, probably until the middle of December. That is something that takes time to roll out as they just do their shuffling around, staff up, all of that sort of thing. The one thing that I want to note too is the fate of the Greater Minnesota Jobs and Economic Finance Division. This is a committee that was created by the House and chaired by Representative Pawlowski. I think to show, hey, Greater Minnesota, we've got a committee that's just for you. We care about your issues. Unfortunately, I think there were a couple of challenges with this committee. One is that they weren't really given much to do. There were any number of Greater Minnesota impacted bills that could have gone through this committee, but for whatever reason they didn't. And so this committee did not have enough to do. And at the same time, you had a lot of good rural members put on this committee that was not given much to do versus being on committees that had more impact on our agenda: taxes, transportation, jobs and economic development, environment, you name it. And so unclear what the fate of this committee will be going forward. If it is going to continue, I do hope that they will be given a more robust portfolio in terms of things that they're supposed to do, because they didn't really this last session, and it was a shame. House GOP leadership, again, this stays the same. Kurt Doubt will continue as the minority leader of an expanded caucus, although he still has 4 or 5 sort of renegade Republican members who refer to themselves as the new Republican caucus, led by Representative Steve Drazkowski. So there's some division there in that group, and as we'll talk about here in a bit, not that uncommon to have these divisions, as it turns out. So the race for the Senate, good view of the Senate chamber there. So again, very tight. There was some shifting around, which resulted in the Republicans maintaining their majority, but only just. And so in the St. Cloud area, you had Eric Putnam beat Senator Jerry Ralph. Dan Sparks, Democrat from Austin, Albert Lee area, lost his race to Gene Dornick. So there will be a change there. Senator Sparks was in the legislature for quite a while, and so it'll be strange not to have him there. And then in an open seat in Plymouth, Ann Johnson Stewart, Democrat, beat Greg Pullis. Burnsville, Lindsey Port beat Dan Hall. He was a senator. He was chair of the local government committee actually in the Senate, so that impacts things like annexation and that discussion. And then Lakeville, you had first-term Senator Matt Little lose to Zach Duckworth in a race in which I'm not sure what the final number was, but it was an ungodly amount of money that was spent in that race in the contest between the two of them. So a look at the balance of power, and here is where yesterday things got interesting. Whereas we were heading into this session with the Republicans having a 35-32 majority, we get to 2020, and it looked like the Republicans were going to maintain their majority by 1. But you had yesterday 2 senators Senator Tom Bach, the former majority leader, former tax chair, and Senator Tomassoni break off and form their own independent caucus. And we playfully call it the Baccassoni caucus there in the bottom. But so you're going to have a split that is 34-31-2. And I want to talk a little bit about this for a minute and what its implications might be here for the next 2 years. So here you have two, I think, what you would characterize as, small c conservative Democrats, both with strong labor backgrounds, both strong on issues related to mining and timber, but also very traditional Democrats in terms of supporting, education and local government aid and things like that. But I think over time, just felt more and more and more and more alienated from their colleagues and from the DFL party. In the statement that they put out yesterday, Senator Bach said that it was largely in response to just the toxic partisanship of both the right and left wings of the spectrum that really kind of drove this decision for them, and that they felt that they could do best by their constituents by being, kind of an independent group on their own. And, I think there's a couple of ways you could read this. I think you could cynically read this as, if you're a Democrat, as sort of these guys kind of taking their marbles and going home because they're upset about the direction of the party in this way or that way. I think some folks basically said good riddance. They're basically Republicans anyways. I don't think that is true at all. I mean, you're still going to see these guys vote, I think, with the Democrats on many votes. But nor do I think that if you're a Republican, you should really think, hey, we've really added two to our team. Well, you sort of have. And the discussion is that both of these guys are going to be given chairmanships. The speculation is that Senator Tomassoni will potentially be the chair of the Higher Education Committee, and that Senator Bach, less clear exactly where he might land, but the speculation has been that it could potentially be the bonding committee, capital investment, although I'm not sure what you do with Senator Senjum in that case. My view of this and my read of it, honestly, is I think that these two guys simply decided that the best way that they can represent their constituents is as independent operators. That just given the way things operated at the legislature, that as they looked at what they felt they needed to get done for their districts in Northeast Minnesota, that was the best way to do it. And so maybe I should be more cynical, but I very much take them at their word, actually, that this is largely driven by being able to best serve their constituents. Clearly there was some coordination with the Republicans in terms of being the potential of being named chairmanships, and clearly there are going to be votes where they vote with the Republicans. But I think that they are really doing this because they feel it's best for their constituents. I think it does raise interesting questions about whether or not either of these two guys will run again in 2022, in 2 years after redistricting. You think you certainly could see a situation where either of them or both might retire, because running as an independent is a hard way to go. It doesn't happen. And the reason I'm dwelling on this is there have been independents in the legislature before, people who have left their party, but it never really made a difference in terms of the dynamic of the flow of work. But with the margin this close in the Senate, this makes a difference. And this puts these guys kind of in a powerful position in terms of being able to maneuver between the two parties and guide a lot of legislation. And so this is something that very much is going to have an impact in terms of what session will look like here going forward. Let's see here. Okay. So a look just at the GOP Senate versus metro versus rural. Again, this is something where it's the flip of what we see with Democrats, in that you have more rural members than metro members, and of course they have none from Minneapolis or St. Paul. It's all suburban, and so that does speak well to our ability to get things done in the Senate. Julie is trying to get my attention.
Did you have a slide about the marijuana party's influence?
That is coming up.
Okay.
Yes, boy, we got a lot to cover. So that's the split there. Not a lot of change, as you can see. This is interesting in that, even though the Senate is basically 50-50, and if on the blue side here, we're throwing in the votes for Bach and Tomassoni, but there were significantly more votes for DFL Senate candidates versus Republicans, and that really has to do with the just concentration of Democrat votes coming out of Minneapolis and St. Paul. There are some districts in Minneapolis where the Democrat wins with 85% of the vote. And so, that I think is a foreshadowing of how the future might look in terms of the state Senate. Now to the marijuana candidates. So one of the other dynamics of this election that I think was just really interesting was the fact that in many cases, you did have one or two marijuana party candidates on the ballot. Either the Legalize Minnesota Now party or the Minnesota Legalize Now party, they were plays on each other's names and virtually indistinguishable from each other. But because they had gained major party status in 2018, it made it easier for these parties to get on the ballot. And so you had a number of races around the state where you had one or two marijuana party candidates. And in some cases, these were, I think, people who were very much for the agenda of legalizing marijuana. And in some cases, the understanding is that these candidates may have been recruited by the Republican Senate operatives to depress a vote for Democrats. And, in some cases, it appeared to potentially work. And so this is just the Dan Sparks race down in southern Minnesota, where you had the Republican win by about 4.5%, but you did have, almost 7% votes cast for the marijuana party candidate. Now, is it a given that all of the marijuana party candidate votes would have gone to Dan Sparks? Not at all, but certainly if Bekvar had not been on the ballot, the result would have been a lot tighter, a lot narrower, and possibly even a Dan Sparks win. And so it did have an impact. There were a couple of other races around the state where it made the margins very close. That Eric Putnam and Jerry Ralph race in the St. Cloud area had a marijuana party candidate that got a significant share of the vote, made that very, very close. The first congressional district, you had a marijuana party candidate that got something like 12% of the vote in the Hagedorn Feehan race. So it did make a difference. It'll be interesting to see if this is a tactic that we see going forward on the part of both parties. If you try to get third parties on the ballot to drain votes from your opponents. This I think is why you saw Representative Winkler trying to deal with the marijuana issue in the last legislative session and did a lot of talking about it, foreseeing this kind of potential here. But so an interesting dynamic and something to pay attention to here going forward. Senate GOP leadership, we still got Senator Paul Gazelka. He was reelected by his colleagues to lead the Senate Republican caucus. And then Susan Kent, who was elected leader just before the legislative session last year. She is from Woodbury. She survived a pretty strong challenge in her own election here in November, as it turned out fairly easily, but I think there were folks who were eyeing that race as one that could flip to the Republicans. And so she will continue as minority leader for the Democrats in the Senate. And so another poll question time. Minnesota is the only state that has a divided legislature, again, for this next 2 years, just like we were the only state 2 years ago. And so do you think that a balance of power between the two is a good thing? Do you think that, no, it's just going to result in more gridlock and fewer things getting done? Or are we just unsure and we'll find out? All right, we got 50% saying that a balance of power is a good thing, 35% saying it's going to result in more gridlock, and 15% on the we're just going to have to find out side. Honestly, I will say in some ways you are all correct in that, for some aspects of the CGMC's agenda, having divided legislature is to our benefit. In some ways, it's going to make things harder, especially when you look at getting, the budget deficit resolved. that is going to drag and drag and drag and drag this next session. And I think there is an aspect of where we're just going to have to find out. And so we are all winners in that analysis there, or all correct, at least in terms of how we're thinking about this. So the implications for governing writ large, and then I'll get to the CGMC in particular. Minnesota remains the only state with a divided legislature, as we talked about. And obviously this year, the biggest thing that they're going to have to do is tackle the state budget. And, we are anticipating that we will have deficits here going forward. And so based on that, I think the budget solutions are really going to be a series of awkward compromises. This is going to be the sort of thing that no one likes. In 2011, during that budget session, when you had Republicans in control of both houses of the legislature and Democrats in control, or in Governor Dayton in the governor's office, we had Ways and Means Chair Mary Liz Holberg, who was involved in budget discussions, and her phrase on it was, we were all in the delivery room, trying to get the baby to come out and deliver it, and it took a long time, and it was arduous, and boy, when that baby came out, it sure was ugly. And so I think we are looking at potentially something similar in terms of how we arrive at a balanced budget. I think you will see, the reserve get pretty well drained, or pretty close to it. You will see, I think, some cuts and changes to programs, probably especially on the health and human service side, to lower overall cost. My guess is you'll get significant reliance on accounting tools and gimmicks, such as the school shift, paying the schools a couple of weeks later, a couple of days later in some cases than you otherwise would, to make the books look better. My guess is you could see some modest increase of revenue, but really on the margins. You're not going to see wide sweeping tax increases. You're not going to see a fifth tier income tax, but you may see an increase in, taxes on things like cigarettes or fees for services, that sort of thing, but not a significant amount. But I think that'll just be part of the balance. And then finally, everybody is waiting for the potential of federal stimulus. I am profoundly convinced that the federal government needs to do something not only for state and local governments, but just for individuals and businesses and the health of all of us as we go into this really uncertain period here. I am not hopeful, however, that we will see that until at least after the inauguration of the new president in January, January 20th. And so it's going to be awkward dealing with the budget. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a later series here. The narrow majorities, I think, will require focus on bread and butter issues and solutions. There's a lot of stuff that might be pet issues of people that are just going to be not picked up because they don't have the governing room because of the narrow majorities in both houses to really deal with things. I do think that the DFL will still likely look to advance racial justice and equity issues. That conversation is still going to be at the legislature this year. And then likewise, the GOP, I think, is still going to have a significant focus on public safety issues, especially in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And, in some ways, they're two sides of the same coin and a lot of kind of talking past each other on the issues. But I think that's what we can expect for governing. Julie has a question.
Yeah, there's a couple questions kind of regarding the marijuana party issues. One is if you think there'll be a change in the threshold for major party status. And then another question is if you think there'll be a statewide marijuana amendment on the ballot. We saw that happen in South Dakota and a few other states.
So the questions had to do with the threshold for gaining major party status. The threshold, for those of you who don't know, is that your party gets 5% in a statewide race. And so you had marijuana party candidates get 5% in, I think it was the Attorney General's race in 2018, and then the state auditor's race. And so they gained ballot access that way. I don't see that threshold necessarily changing. And I just don't see it changing. I'm not sure that I have a great reason other than it's just kind of what my gut says. To the issue of putting marijuana on the ballot, unlike a lot of states that have initiative and referendum and can essentially pass laws, via referendum and ballot, the only thing that we can change sort of by public referendum is the state constitution. And so I think it would be unlikely that we would take up marijuana and enshrine that in the state constitution in any ways. I do think, though, that once you have DFL majorities, if you have DFL majorities again in the House and the Senate and the governor's office, I think you will sooner rather than later probably see some expansion of access to marijuana. Good questions. So the challenges for CGMC in terms of divided government and kind of how things shook out. As we talked about, a loss of rural legislators in the House DFL caucus, that is going to be impactful. That will be a challenge that we're going to have to contend with. Likewise, whether they're in the majority or the minority, there are a significant number of new rural legislators that we're going to have to get to and educate on our issues and make sure that they understand where we're coming from, which is going to be a challenge, in this remote environment that we're operating in. I think just the overall increasing rural metro polarization is really making things difficult. My sense is that there's a lot of metro members who are just kind of tired of hearing about Greater Minnesota. And then likewise, there's a lot of Greater Minnesota members who are almost too fixated on the metro. And I'd like to hear some of those members talk more about what they're going to do for their communities and less about what they think of Minneapolis and St. Paul. That's what we need, is a positive focus from rural legislators on what they're going to do to help rural Minnesota. So I think that continues to be an issue. And then long-term implications of redistricting will enhance, I think, the challenges for rural Minnesota here over the coming years. And that's the last topic that we're going to touch on here. And then we'll take a couple of questions. Every 10 years we do redistricting, and that is in addition to the budget. Theoretically, the other big thing that the legislature needs to contend with this year. So the process begins, it goes through the legislature here in Minnesota. There are other states that have commissions or feed it into a computer and spits things out. But in Minnesota, we, at least initially, rely on our legislature to try to figure it out. And so it'll go through a process of committees. There will be bills that get introduced, laying out maps and plans. The Legislative Coordinating Commission, which is a nonpartisan office within the legislature, will help with this task in terms of gathering information and doing some of the number crunching and the mapping and things like that. If the legislature is unable to adopt a plan by statutory deadline, it then gets referred to the courts. And this is what's happened the last several cycles. We have not had a map actually created and passed and implemented by the legislature for several cycles here. We didn't have one in 2012. We didn't have one in 2002. It goes back a ways before you get to a map that actually went through the legislative process. The deadline is 25 weeks before the primary election, so February 15th of 2022. And the plans must be decided early enough to give time to prepare, for state elections, obviously. Here's a little bit of look at the timeline again. Finish up the census, get it reported, here by the end of the year. Early spring, we'll get kind of all the data files and the work will begin. And then by 2022, we have to have the maps complete. So obviously, this is all based on population. And so here's a look since 1950 of population change in Minnesota between Greater Minnesota and the 7-county metro. And starting in 1950, there were more rural residents in our state, and I think that is something that is not necessarily surprising. Lots of parity, kind of the 70s through the 90s, and at that point, you start to see a divergence, a flattening out of the population growth in Greater Minnesota, and a significant increase, in the Twin Cities, and I think that is something that we expect, obviously, to continue. So if you look at, over time, seats in the legislature kind of by county, the metro in both the Senate and the House, have had more seats. What is interesting is that as these maps have gone through the courts, the split between Greater Minnesota and the metro has been pretty stable over time here, with the current map being in the Senate 33 metro, 28 rural, and then 6 that kind of straddle counties that are both in the 7-county metro and what we consider Greater Minnesota, and then likewise a similar split in the House. But there is a significant disparity in population, and this is just the difference in population between the 7-county metro and greater Minnesota. And so you saw a big increase between the last time we did redistricting in 2012 in that disparity to now here in 2020. Again, put another way in terms of percent increase, really focusing on the last column there, 2012 to 2020, both greater Minnesota and the metro gained in residents. But as you can see, obviously the metro pace of gain was so much greater than in greater Minnesota. And so, that's going to have implications here over time. So if you were to just kind of play this game of apportioning seats here, just based on doing math. So if you, take the statewide, population and divide it by 134 in the case of the House and 67 in the case of the Senate, this is sort of what you get. And if you were to project it out, greater Minnesota would end up somewhere in the range of, 29 seats, give or take, and the metro with 37, give or take. And then in the House, the metro with, almost 75 or so, and greater Minnesota at about 59. So that's, a projection based simply on math. This is not a prediction of what's going to happen. We don't know yet. We'll have to see probably what the courts end up saying. But if you just did the math, this is how it would likely play out. So one last final question for the group here is, sort of given all of that and given all of the dynamics of the legislature that we discussed, how concerned are you about the increased concentration of Democratic control in the metro and Republican control in greater Minnesota? All right, so a fair amount of concern across the board, at least moderately or extremely. And I'm, personally concerned for a number of reasons. One, I just don't think it's healthy for the civic discussion in our state to have this kind of polarization. And then two, just from the perspective, the lens of our work, it certainly does make it more challenging to operate. And I think, highlights the importance of the work that CGMC does in a lot of areas, because if they're, if we were not here, there would be no one else raising some of these questions, doing some of these work, highlighting some of these issues, putting the focus on some of these issues in the way that we are. And so I think that continues to speak to the need of our collective action. So with that, we've got a couple of minutes here before our first scheduled break. We can certainly take some questions if you want to put them into the chat, and then Julie or Kelly will read them to me because I'm not good at managing the chat, but happy to take a question or two from folks. Nothing coming through? All right. We'll give it another minute here. Otherwise, I'll just preview our next session, which is at 11:15. Oh, we do have a question.
So is the DFL just waiting on the redistricting to take control of the Senate?
So the question was, is the DFL just waiting on redistricting to take control of the Senate? You talk to Democrats generally, and I will take it out of the Senate context. Sometimes you do get the sense, talking to some of the more, we'll say, partisan and myopic Democrats, of which there are some, as there are partisan and myopic Republicans. But you do get the sense from some Democrats that they're kind of they are playing this waiting game, that demographics will eventually enshrine in their minds a permanent, Democratic majority and dominance. I might have thought that maybe, a while ago, but I think that the outcome, especially nationally, of how, things just went in terms of one outcome at the top level and then a very muddled outcome at the congressional and legislative level, I think throws some of these things into question. I think we're getting new and different alignments, coalitions within these parties, in terms of, a lot of folks who identify with labor, especially in the trades, swing towards Republicans, largely based on the full-throated Republican support for things like mining and Line 3 and things like that versus the environmental questions that the Democrats have. And so I think in their minds, some of them are playing a waiting game, but at least for the foreseeable future, the next 10 years, I mean, you are going to need to have some seats in rural Minnesota to have a majority, whether you are a Republican or Democrat. Another question?
So I have a couple questions. I'll give you, one's harder than the other. So I'll give you the slightly easier one first. How likely is it that the Bacchusoni caucus will attract any other followers in the Senate, such as Eakin or others?
So the question was how likely is it that the Bach-Tomasoni breakaway group will attract others, such as Senator Kent Eakin? I think, the most likely person to, in my view, who would have been a candidate to join that group would have been Senator Sparks, who was defeated this last time. I could have seen him going with those guys. Senator Eakin, I think is less likely, even though, he would certainly vote with those guys when they were Democrats quite a bit. But I just think based on Senator Eakin's personality, his district is different and the issues in his district are different. I mean, his district is very rural, but also includes Moorhead and, higher education and things like that. So I think just because of his personality, his history, his dad was a DFL, state lawmaker, I think it's less likely.
And to follow up on that same question is, will that new caucus move to vote with the GOP on sending any of Walls's commissioners packing?
Well, I think, the question was, will they vote with the Republicans on ousting some of Walls's commissioners? I very well could see that. I think if my memory serves that one or both of those guys did vote to get rid of Commissioner Kelly. So they've already done that. So I think absolutely, if a commissioner comes up that they have a distaste for, I think there's no question that they could vote with the Republicans to oust them.
I have one more question. It's a tougher one, but what are the chances we will learn to work together again? Should we go back to a no party designation legislature? Interesting.
So the question was, what are the chances that we can break through the partisanship and learn to work together again? Or should we go back to the way it was prior to the early 1970s, where we had no partisan designation for members in the legislature? I don't know what it's going to take, but it definitely has to change. And, that's where, honestly, I think, again, an organization like CGMC can actually play a role in helping to bridge some of those discussions between the parties, because I think that the more that you stray away from facts and reality in one's rhetoric, and certainly both parties, I think, in many cases have, it's going to be harder to find common ground. And so I think, one of the things that CGMC does well, I think, is operate on a bipartisan basis, using facts, using information, bringing forward arguments that are not partisan in nature, but are reality based. And so I think that, it's going to be incumbent on all of us as we engage with the legislature and other groups as well, to put our best foot forward and to, not unnecessarily inflame rhetoric on either side. It doesn't mean that we don't get people ginned up on our issues, but I think that we certainly have a role to play in that as well.